Welcome to another episode of Park Avenue Plastic Surgery Class, the podcast where we explore controversies and breaking issues in plastic surgery. I'm your co-host, Doreen Wu, and I'm excited to be here with Dr. Lawrence Bass, Park Avenue plastic surgeon, educator, and technology innovator. The title of today's episode is Understanding the FDA's New Breast Implant Regulations and Black Box Warning. Breast augmentations are one of the most popular and commonly performed surgical cosmetic procedures in the United States. When considering breast implants, people often have many questions, such as whether to get silicone or saline implants, what size to get, which style, what the aftercare looks like, and the long-term risks associated with implants. So Dr. Bass, what is the news about breast implants? What do I need to know to make an informed decision?
Well, the FDA was concerned that a lot of the information about the performance of breast implants and some new things that we're learning about the behavior of certain types of breast implants were not being communicated adequately to every patient that was considering whether or not they wanted to have breast implants placed. The first important thing to remember is breast implants are used for cosmetic use. That's about 3/4 of the breast implants. And the other 25% is for breast reconstruction after breast cancer surgery. So breast implants are an important part of medical care for those patients. And we want them to be around, available, and we want to know everything about what's involved in their use so we can adequately communicate that to patients. And FDA was wondering, though, what are patients being told? How much of that information did the average surgeon tell them? How much variation was there? And there were some new developments like anaplastic large cell lymphoma, or ALCL, which is a new development that we became aware of over the last several years, and they wanted to be sure that information about that was available to patients as well.
In response to this concern, what did the FDA decide to do? What did they put on this black box warning?
So the FDA decided to, in their recent regulation, which came out the very end of October in 2021 and fully went into effect 30 days later, they decided to take several steps. They did put a black box warning, or what's called a boxed warning officially at FDA, on breast implants. They required that there be a patient decision checklist that's followed as part of the consent process to provide patients a step-by-step process for considering all of the important information in FDA's view about breast implants before they decide whether to go ahead or not. They provided regulation on presenting information on the materials that are in breast implants and device description so that people understood what they're putting in their bodies, what the materials are. They added a patient device card regulation that was somewhat updated from the existing device cards. They wanted patients presented with manufacturer-specific performance data after the initial approval studies, which look at the patients out to a typical length of time. In many FDA studies, that's 6 months or a year. But these implants, of course, remain in patients for decades. So FDA required each manufacturer to complete a post-approval study following patients for years and years after implants had been placed. So they wanted patients to see some of that performance data to understand what kind of problems develop with breast implants down the line. And finally, the FDA updated some of their screening recommendations for how to perform surveillance on silicone gel breast implants to determine if there's a hidden rupture of the implant or not.
Earlier, you mentioned anaplastic large cell lymphoma. What is the story behind ALCL? Is it breast cancer?
So ALCL is not breast cancer. It is a form of cancer that can form in the capsule or scar tissue that heals around a breast implant. At this point in time, it has only been identified in patients who have received a textured breast implant or who at one point in time had a textured breast implant in their body. Patients who have only had smooth breast implants currently have not identified a case of ALCL, although theoretically it might be possible. So this tumor develops in the capsule. It may show as a lump or hardening of the breast, overlying skin rash, or sometimes there's a fluid collection around the implant which could produce breast enlargement. So if any of those signs are seen in anybody who has a breast implant in, they should see their plastic surgeon to be evaluated. Typically, this is treated by removing the implant in the capsule, and if that's caught early, that's all the treatment that's required. If it is found very late in the game, sometimes other treatments are required. So this is something that we've just seen in the last several years. It's very, very rare, but FDA felt that this new finding needed to be part of the consent process. The current risk, as we understand it at the time of this recording, is that the lifetime risk of getting breast implant-associated ALCL is somewhere between 1 in 2,200 and 1 in 86,000. So very uncommon, very low risk, but certainly something to factor into decision-making.
What are the big items on risks and outcomes that the FDA wants patients to consider and be aware of in deciding whether or not to get breast implants?
So ALCL was one of them, and there's also some concern nowadays in some patients that the implants have produced sort of a brain fog or fatigue, other kinds of systemic symptoms. This is called breast implant illness, which is controversial, but they wanted patients to at least be aware that some people believe that the implants themselves can cause some of these symptoms. The other really important features that FDA was keying into was the following: that the implants are not expected to be a lifetime implant. Like any device, it can wear out and fail, and that necessitates more surgery, anesthesia, recovery time, more money out of pocket. And I've always told my patients, if you like the idea of having bigger breasts, but you never want to think about the implants again, this is not a good idea. If you like the idea of adjusting your breast size and you accept that it means somewhere in the future more surgery, more tinkering with the implants, potentially implant removal or replacement, then, patients love their breast implants and typically are very satisfied, but you have to understand what you're signing up for. They also wanted patients to understand that you should undergo regular surveillance. Plastic surgeons typically like to see their breast implant patients once a year and at any time if there's a change in the implant. And they wanted patients to understand that the screening for possible rupture of silicone gel implants, not saline implants, involves more testing, more out-of-pocket expense in most cases.
The term black box warning sounds ominous. Should it make patients afraid, or does it mean that the product is dangerous?
It's not so much that the product is dangerous, but there are some significant considerations with implants, as I just described, as well as other things that can happen, rupture, capsular contracture. And these are important. And because of the importance, and because this is, in the case of cosmetic breast surgery, a completely elective treatment, they wanted to be sure that patients factored this into their decision-making. And by highlighting it in a boxed warning, it makes sure that that information is part of what all patients are notified about prior to deciding they think it's a good idea to go ahead and get breast implants.
There's a lot of complexity here. I can see how confusing it can be. Are these regulations a good thing? Are they worth the time and effort?
So I think anything that standardizes care and makes sure nothing slips through the cracks is a good idea. I typically have a very extensive discussion with my patients about breast implants because I think they really need to know what they're signing up for. And as I said, my patients love them. They have a great time. But if you get into trouble with an implant, it can be a very frustrating experience and can really put people through the ringer. And out of fairness, it's important to recognize that, like everything in life, there are risks. And the FDA's new requirement to show for the individual manufacturer's implant exactly what the performance is like, which put another way means exactly what the frequency or incidence of different kinds of problems and complications are as the implant ages, is a really good idea because this isn't supposed to be an impulse decision. It's supposed to be something that's well thought out. It is elective, so there's the luxury of time to make sure you're making the right decision. So it doesn't mean that implants are bad or intrinsically problematic, but we do have enough experience to be able to say what the problems are, and people can decide before they're in trouble with an implant whether this is a risk they'd care to take or not.
It is reassuring to know that the FDA has taken a number of steps to address the risks and strengthen their safety requirements. Can you give us some important takeaways before we close?
So I think the concept that this could be a lifetime implant is disingenuous. I've always told patients that the implant will wear out eventually. Typically, implants are placed in people who are going to be alive for many decades. And so the likelihood is high that eventually, and it often does take decades, multiple decades, but eventually the implant will probably wear out and need to be either removed or replaced. And interestingly, almost every patient, even if they're now well into their senior citizen years, typically requests to have the implants not just removed when they fail, but also replaced. Because this is part of their self-image that they're accustomed to now, and they don't want to give that up. So I think that's a very telling detail about the experience with breast implants, despite the fact that there can occasionally be problems. The other takeaway is it's important to get the surveillance, have an ongoing relationship with the plastic surgeon who placed it, get the imaging if you have silicone gel implants. But even though FDA made many of these new recommendations and requirements more demanding, the surveillance actually became more liberal based on the post-approval study data and based on improvements in ultrasound technology, where ultrasound can be used as well as MRI to screen for hidden or occult implant rupture, although MRI is still the most sensitive test and still probably the right move for someone who's symptomatic if the ultrasound is equivocal or does not find a rupture. But that ability to do the ultrasound, which increasingly can be done in the plastic surgeon's office, is a way that reduces the inconvenience and expense of doing the surveillance.
Well, this was certainly an informative episode. For people who are considering breast implant surgery, I hope today's episode provided some valuable information and insight. If this episode sparked any unanswered questions, please contact us and we would be happy to discuss them in a future episode. This is Doreen Wu, thanking you for joining Dr. Bass and me for this discussion of the FDA's new rules and regulations for breast implants. Be sure to join us next time, and don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to avoid missing all of the exciting content that is coming your way.
Thank you for joining us in this episode of the Park Avenue Plastic Surgery Class podcast with Dr. Lawrence Bass, Park Avenue plastic surgeon, educator, and technology innovator. The commentary in this podcast represents opinion. This podcast does not present medical advice, but rather general information about plastic surgery that does not necessarily relate to the specific conditions of any individual patient. No doctor-patient relationship is established by listening to or participating in this podcast. Consult your physician to advise you about your individual healthcare. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends, and be sure to subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts.